salt to cause the ice to melt. And someone told him it's bizoy noichel, it's bal tashchis. So I had a good feeling that this is bringing us to a very interesting sugya, the question of salt and halacha. How do you look at salt? How do you touch up salt? And I'll give you a few choices. Maybe salt is an oichel, a regular oichel. In fact, you eat it, so maybe it's an oichel. Maybe it's not reasonable to say it's an oichel, you don't eat plain salt. Maybe it's more like a tavlin, like a spice. And spice has its own halachas in Hilchos Shabbos. Maybe, very often, it's none of the above. Maybe it's a new metzias. And maybe salt is like water. Now, why do I say that? I'll explain you in a moment. But I do believe once we understand what salt is, we'll be able to apply it to all the different shilas. So we do find perhaps a start. The halacha is in Shulchan Aruch Reish Dalet Siv Ches. It's based on a Gemara. If a person eats a food only exclusively for refuah, for example, he never eats broccoli. Doesn't like it. He wouldn't eat it no matter what. But the doctor said you must eat broccoli, so he eats broccoli the refuah. So the Gemara says Shulchan Aruch paskins, if you eat it the refuah, since it's an oichel, you make a bracha. But the notable exception to that is water. If someone drinks water not for the taste, he just drinks water to get down a pill, or he wants to make a bracha rishayna, bracha achrayna, to have another bracha. Water is different. You don't make a bracha unless you enjoy it. Maybe salt is also like that, because salt is not really an oichel. Maybe if you eat it l'shem achila, okay, make a bracha, but typically not. So the emes is, if you look at the Mishnah Erev and Chavav Mud Beis, talk about a different context, but you have to learn, you have to get to see the big picture. The Mishnah says you're allowed to make an Erev Tchuma with anything, chutz min hamayim or min hamelech. Those are the two exceptions. So the Mishnah groups salt and water. Why is salt and water no good for an Erev? Everything else is good. So Rashi explains, because it's not zon. There is no nutritional benefit in water, and the same is true regarding salt. So you have a pretty good lead that salt is like water. But wait, we're not finished. The Mishnah has a second anlacha. If someone makes a neder not to have any midi dizon, so he can't eat any food except for water and salt. Again, the Svara says the Gemara, because salt and water are the only two foods that have no zon, that are not zon. Oh, so we see we're getting close. The Mishnah twice in halacha. This is a gepaskin in Hilchos Tchumin, in Archaim Shin Pevav Hey, and in Yeredeya Reish Zayin Tes, that salt and water are one. Very good. But Lamaisa, we could even do more. The halacha is, this is a Gemara in Brachas, it's a Mishnah, it's a Gemara in Brachas Memamad Beis. Any food that grows from the ground, you make a bar pri adama. What doesn't grow from the ground? For example, melech or zamis. Zamis is salt water. Then you make a shahakol. And that's very similar to the case of water. With the Gemara in Brachas Taf Mem Dalet, Shulchan Aruch Reish Dalet Zayin, Hashoyse mayim litzmoi, you make a shakol. So we see that maybe it's not such a bad idea to compare salt to water. We see two halachas in the Mishnah, and halacha regarding shahakol. But l'chayra, we have a different Gemara that shows an extremely important aspect of salt. Zokti mar brachis daf mem acha kol achilascha achol melech. After you eat a suda, make sure you have a little bit salt and a little bit water. So this is the fourth time we see a comparison, salt and water. Now what's the pshat? So let me explain. It seems from the Gemara that salt should be part of one's diet. Okay, today they're very busy not to have too much salt, but a person needs a little bit salt. And it also seems, and we'll see this as we go along, it's important to mention that they didn't add salt to the food itself. They had a salt dish, and if they wanted, they would take the food and dip it into salt. Zok the Gemara, if you had no salt in the food, make sure you have the plain salt at the end of the meal. You have to have some salt in your diet. And this is Gepaskin in Kufay and Tes Sivav. When you finish eating, have a little bit salt. Zok the Ramah in the end of Kuf Ayin. Why don't we have this today? Because in our diets and our foods, they add salt when it's in its production. So at the end of the day, you always have salt in it when you're eating. Okay, very nice. So we see an interesting thing, two things. Number one, you must have salt in your diet. Number two, and this is important, in the olden days, they didn't add salt to the food itself, they would add it afterwards. And we'll soon see how this impacts our halacha. Achila shalonu, zok the Mishnah Berurah in the end of Kuf Ayin Tes, has salt in it. Now, before we move on, I want to tell you a few interesting halachas regarding salt and minei testaya milsa. There is a minig that when you move into a new home, so people put, before they go, move in, they put bread and salt. Where's that coming from? So the Paiskim explained, the earlier Paiskim explained, is based on the Avos Rav Nosson in Perek Chaf, where the Avos Rav Nosson says when a person is b'chois kol, what does it mean b'chois kol? He's missing everything. It means he doesn't have at least salt and chaimitz. That is a klala. That's b'chois kol. So therefore, mida taiva merubah, if you want to feel like you're you have everything, you have bread and you have salt. I saw the Mishnah Sechir and the Tshuva asked, if that's the source, why don't you also bring to the new house vinegar? So a good kasha. But the Maisa, it seems the minig is to bring bread and salt. Someone told me, Bezeyas apecha toicha lechem. Lechem is bread, and zeyas apecha is salt, sweat, whatever. So the Maisa, it's a skula. But I think the best part of the skula, what Baruch Lebelza said, you put bread and salt into the house, and when you move in, take the bread and salt and give it to an ani. Like every other good school that works, you do a mitzvah, that's the best school. Another interesting concept regarding salt, in Horius Yud Gimel, the Gemara says there are different things that are good, moyel zikaron, help you remember your learning, and the yesh oimrim, if you eat a little bit salt with your finger. Now you learn the Gemara, it's a little bit challenging to know what that means, which finger, how much, and some say it's a stira. That's why I think the best skula to remember your learning is chazara. If it doesn't work, a little more chazara, a lot more chazara. Reb Chaim Volozhin in Keser Rosh Nun Zayin quotes that when he was young and he said his mind was very sharp, he came to the Geiser Rebbe, the Goyin, and he said, I chazit, say the moyed 14 times, and I don't have it. So the Goyin says, you expect to know it with 14 times? That's enough chazara? So he says, what, you have to chaz 101 times? He goes, no. Kol yamad ba'amoid v'chazer. Your whole life you have to chazar. But at least a few times chazara you do need, and that's better than all the schoolers. No. But before I apply this Lamaisa, I think this is one of the major sugyas on Hilchas Salt, is the Gemara in Brachas Daf Mem. The Gemara says if a person makes a bracha, and before he eats, he talks out, he has to repeat the bracha. But, according to Rabbi Yochanan, if he made a bracha and before he ate, he said, bring salt, or bring lifton. We're going to teach the word lifton as a dip. It's close enough. But bring salt or bring the dip, then he doesn't have to make a bracha. Or, he told them, feed the animal, in between Amoitzi and before you ate, which is the worst hefsik. But you don't repeat the bracha. Why? So Rashi explains, it's a tzarech bracha. Now, bishleim, but to feed the animal before you eat, that's taka pasuk in the Torah, whether it's the rice or the rabbanim, but it's a pasuk, and then the chal savot. But why bringing salt and bringing dip? What's the kedusha of a dip? So Rashi says very practical, because you made a brach on this piece of bread, and the bread of the olden days was not seasoned, didn't have salt in it. It wasn't too tasty, so you have to make sure that the prusas hamoitzi is nechol betam. Pashut, practical. It should be a good tasting piece of bread. Keep that in mind, please. So Lamaisa, we see that if you spoke out, bring salt, but the evidence not a hefsik. Zok Toisvis on this Gemara and says, hey, why today? Oh no, we don't bring salt on the table to dip in the bread. I thought you needed it for the bracha. So Zok Toisvis, because we have bread that's more tasty. The bread itself is tasty without the salt. And he referenced the Gemara, where the Gemara says, Les dein tzarech baishish. Now, what did that mean? The Gemara on the same Daf Mem tells a story that Rava came to the Reish Galus's house. He ate bread, but he didn't add salt. Rav, you say you have to have salt? He said, the bread in the Reish Galusa's house, it must have been a very wealthy home. It's tasty as it is, you don't need salt. Less dain, sarach baishis, you don't have to wait for the salt, the bread itself is good. Now, what we see from this Gemara might be surprising to some, that there's no din in having salt on the table, and there's no din of dipping bread into salt. Salt is like a dip. It's a chetimtza to have a tasty piece of bread. Bezehu. So if you have a nice bagel, a nice Shabbos challah, that's very tasty. You don't need salt on the table. You don't need to dip into salt. That's the sheet of Taisis. In other words, if you have a tasty piece of challah, we will quote the Gemara, Les dain tzarech baishis eskezun tehait. No salt, no dipping. And indeed, the Mechaba, based on the Torah in Kuf Samach Zayin Hey, he says, don't make a moitz without having salt. But if you have bread that's tasty as it is, you don't need salt. So today, I think we could assume all the bread today, and challahs and bagels, etc., is tasty as it is. You would need salt on the table or no dipping necessary. However, here we see an extremely important feature of salt, and that's Taisus continues. Miyu Rabbeinu Menachem hayim medagdek ma'oid. Now you have to realize the Rishonim didn't talk with superlatives. A big mitzvah, very important, but here it's unusual. Medagdek ma'oid. He was very careful to lahavi melech ala shulchan. He made sure before he started a meal to have salt on the table. You have to learn this carefully. Nothing about dipping or eating salt. Make sure there's salt on the table. What's that? Why? And listen to this. When Yidden are waiting to make hamoitzi, now in most homes, I think a lot of homes, till the last child comes in and finishes washing, you're waiting impatiently, patiently, but you're waiting for the child to come, and no one's learning. You're wasting time. Zok Taisvis, Mamtin Mezeh, and the Maisa Sat Mekatreg. Look, Yidden are wasting time. Ubris Melech Tagin Aleim. So if you have salt, salt is a shmira. This is Taisvis. So it seems that even though the bread is tasty as it is, you don't need it for the taste. You need salt on the table because salt is a insurance policy. Now the Shabali Aleket, another one of the Rishonim, Simon Kuf Mem Aleph, also asked the question, why do we have salt on the table? Today's bread is tasty. So he quotes the Goinim. He's going back before the Rishonim. Because the Maisa Shulchan Doimel Mizbeach. And by Mizbeach the Pasuk says, Al Kol Kaban Chatakrav Melech. So therefore you have to have salt on the table. Now this is very inspiring. My table and your table is not just, we're not eating, and zich, we're not fressing. We are bringing karbonis. In fact, Mr. Bura says when you eat L'Shem Shemayim, so your achila is like a mizbeach, is like a carbon. Your shulchan is a mizbeach, and your eating is like a carbon. And this is really a Gemara in Brachas Nun Hey. Zeh ha-shulchan asher lefnei Hashem, zog the Gemara, pasach b'mizbeach v'sayim b'shulchan. Yes, shulchan doimel mizbeach. Now, oy bazoi, we see something very interesting. That lemaisa, a Yiddish shulchan is like a mizbeach. And I once made a collection. This is some of the halachas that based on shulchan doimel mizbeach. The Magen Avraham says, don't kill a louse, a mosquito, whatever it is on the table, because the mizbeach is not a place to kill little insects. The Sefer Chassidim says, don't put a child onto the table, or an adult should sit on the table. Doimel mizbeach. The Paiskim say, don't put a davar mos on the table. And I just saw the other day, the Ben Ish Chai and Emra Ois Yud, don't give from the pas of the Moitzi Lechem and Aretz to a goy, because Shulchan Doimel Mizbeach, and that piece of bread is like a carbon. Okay, if you have to, you have to. But he's saying, the Shulchan is very much Doimel Mizbeach. So now we see where salt plays an integral role in a Yiddish shulchan. But if you'll notice, nobody says you have to dip the salt or eat the salt. It's basically having salt on the table. I'll give you a mashal like you have the Shabbos flowers. You don't eat the flowers. It's there. And now you appreciate the Ramah. After the Mechab and Kuf Samach Zayin says that today we don't need salt, so the Ramah quotes both the Tosfos and the Shabali Aleket. Mitzvah lahavi al kol hashulchan melech. Why? Shulchan doimel mizbeach, and who make him in a piraniyos. So the Ramah combines both Taisus and the Shibali Aleket. And this is interesting, that Lamaisa, we don't yet see anything about dipping the challah into salt. Where did that come from? To my knowledge, the Magen Avram and Sivkot and Tezvav adds a new phase. Besides having bread on the table, so the Magen Avram, Kasva Mekubalim, this is the Shari Mitzvahs, Litval Prusa B'tzia B'melech. Dip the bread into salt. No difference weekday or Shabbos. It's bread into salt. The Mishnah Berurah and Sivkot and Lamed Gimel quotes it slightly different. Kasva Mekubalim Litval Prusa Moitzi B'melech Shalosh Pamim. 3 times. In other words, the Mishnah Berurah is adding 3 Chadushim on the Mechaba. According to the Mechaba that we have past the Kia, you don't need salt at all. So the Mishnah Berurah, based on all the earlier, number 1, we put salt on the table. Number 2, it's not just there like the Shabbos flowers, we dip it in. And it's not like the Magen Avram once, Magen Avram doesn't say, but 3 times. Now why 3 times? So again, this is out of my range, but Lamaisa, what at least I can understand, the Yafal Alev explains, in that pasuk, Kol Karban Chatakiv Melech, you look it up, it says 3 times the word Melech. V'kol Karban Minchas, Melech Timloich, Leisash bis Melech Bris, and again, Kol Karban Chatakiv Melech. That's number 1. Number 2, Melech and Lechem is really the same oasis, and both of them are Gematria 78. 3 times Shem Havaya, 3 times 26 is 78. Okay? Now also, the Mekubalim explain that Lechem is Midas Chesed, salt is Midas Hadin, so we dip the Chesed into Din to be Goiva over the Midas Hadin. Okay? Now, I think maybe that's why 3 times to make a Chazak out of it, but Lamaisa, we see a lot of milas in salt. You have a chicken that's geschachten, but you're not allowed to eat it because it has to be salted. What does salted mean? You have to kasher it. Salt, before they had refrigeration, salt preserved food. You couldn't keep food that long, but once you salted it, you kept it. Bekitza, there's a lot. If you want to see it, the Kaf HaChaim and Sivkot and Lamed Zayin and our Simon Kuf Samach Zayin explains Al Pikabola exactly why we take salt. But no doubt about it, that there is something very special about salt more than any other food. Now, probably the pashtus of the sug is based on a medrash in Bereshis Hey Ois Dalet. Rashi in Vayikra Beis Yud Gimel quotes it briefly, but it's an incredible medrash. The medrash says when the Barstam divided between the Mayim above and below, so the Mayim came crying. Mayim Boichim, says the medrash, that Rabbi Shalom is not fair. We used to be so close to you, and now we were sent down to this world. Stam. And also, another Chazal add, you use the midbar to give the Torah, you use the ground for people, and what are you used for us? So Rabbi says, oh, you're really striving for Kivas Alikim, for Ruchnias? Don't worry. The water will be used for Nischamaya. And the salt will be used in every single korban. I always felt that the ruchnius of salt is because salt, like the water, yearned for ruchnius, for Kibbutz Alikim. It wanted to be close to Kadosh Baruch Hu. And the Baruch made a whole mapecha and made every korban has to have salt. But be that as it may, again, but there's no doubt about it that salt has a ruchnius that no other food has. So Lamaisa, let me be very clear. If you see someone that sits down Shabbos or weekday and makes a moitzi and eats bread and doesn't even have salt on the table, you can't say he's doing wrong. That's the shita of Toisvis, the first shita, and that's the Mechaber shita. But the minig, I think in Roiv Tvutz Yisrael is like the Ramah, Toisvis, Shibali Aleket, that we make sure to have salt on the table because of the Shmira, and more so, the Mishnah Berurah's Psak, Magen Avram, and earlier, not only to have it on the table just like the Shabbos flowers, but to dip it in 3 times. But again, that's based on minhag. Someone asked me, do you have to dip it in? It's easier to sprinkle the salt onto the bread. So I told him that would only work if you have pas, she'ein and akiyah, and the salt is there to give flavor. But if you want to use midas hadin and midas harachamim, and you want to do 3 times in the keneged 3 times Shem Havaya, so you missed the boat. The ik is dipping 3 times, that has all the milas. Now, if someone, this is an important question to mention, some people have very strict with their sodium intake. They can't have any salt. So they could do the minig just like the rest of us. Believe it or not, they could take the bread, dip it into salt, and then blow off the salt. There's no din of eating salt. The din is having salt on the table, phase number 1. Phase number 2, dip it in 3 times, and din and rachamim, and 3 times is great. But no din of eating it. So dip it in and blow it off, and you have the same school and the same shmir. I'll soon tell you where I found this similar to that, but I want to mention a point that's very convincing. The Shulchan HaTorah, the Kaman and our Simon Kuf Samach Zayin, he's very forceful about it. He says, people today, they have salt, they dip the bread, the challah, the Shabbos challah, especially into salt, and they eat it. Because why don't you do better than that? The Gemara says you're supposed to have salt or a tavlin. So it's to make the psiyas hamoitzi more chashiv. So even during the week, there's a focus to make the bread more tasty. Certainly Shabbos. So why don't you first put it the salt, then you put into the dips, or maybe some of the fish juice, make it tasty. And he writes very strongly about it. He says, we see that was the original halacha. And more recently, Rav Sternbuch and Chelikei Samach Beis has this point as well. That the Gemara seems to be focused on 2 things. The ikka, I should say, the ikka of the Gemara is make it tasty. So why not make it more tasty? Especially covered Shabbos. He says, the whole suit you have with very tasty bread, challah. Punkt, the hamoitzi is just salt. So that's something to think about. If you want to do that, fine. Today we have many dips, so that's always an option. But to me it was inspiring how every step we make, it has to follow the Dvar Hashem. Dipping, blowing it off, before hamoitzi, after hamoitzi. Let's move on. Leil Seder, there's a whole discussion about using salt or not. Pashit, Leil Seder, we have to have salt. Because the matzah is one of the only breads, quote unquote, that has no salt in it. And it's very delicious in Ruchni, but it's not so tasty in Gashmi. And plus, if we look at dipping salt as a davar Ruchni, so manishtana halayla hazeh, and that's why the Mechaber sheet in Taf Ayin Hey Sif Yud, v'yitpalam b'melech, zok teber heitiv, ken hu b'ksavim. And that's the meaning of Svardim, to dip the matzah into the salt for all the reasons that we do during the rest of the year. There's no problem of gebroks, obviously, so why not? However, the Ramah says, ve'ein ha'minig litvel b'melech, on the Leilei Pesach, why not? Zok the Mishnah Berurah, because we have to have lechem oini, and it shouldn't be so tasty. In other words, let me be clear, all agree, the rest of Pesach, all the day Sudas and the Yom Tov Sudas, the Chalamoid Sudas, Avada use salt. It's only the Leilei Pesach, the Ramah's minig is not to use salt. Now, some Mekubalim accomplish both. They dip the matzah into salt 3 times and blow it off. So then they have Alamaylis. Then I saw Takat Kafachayim, which, like we said, regarding the person that can't have salt. A very interesting question is, Leilei Rosh Hashanah, the minig is to dip the challah into honey, which is a very nice minig, but first have priorities. How could you not do the salt? So that's why many poskim say you dip the challah into salt 3 times and then into honey. Now some say it's not a good shidduch, salt with honey. So some say put the honey on one side and the salt on the other side. But I want to tell you one thing. It's interesting. The Puchacha says when you dip the challah into honey, do it only twice. Why only twice? He says because lemaisa the word honey, dvash, is 306. 306 times 2 is 612. And bracha shleima, and I figured it out so you can trust me, is exactly the gematria 612. So keep cheshbon. Dip the salt into the salt 3 times and dip the challah into the honey only twice. The Chassam Sofer's minig was that Leil Shabbos he would not dip the challah into the salt because kol kabon chatakev melach, but no kabonis Leil Shabbos kayidua. But Avad Chassam Sofer himself had salt on the table because nothing changed as far as the hagana of salt. That's for sure. Also, the Mishnah Halachas Chelik Yotzim Memches has other reasons why the Chassam Sofer had that minig, but no doubt about it, the Dvar Hashem Zu Halach is very detailed. I saw, in fact, a discussion if someone's traveling and he has no salt. Is there any salt substitute? So the interesting eitzah that the Kafachayim quotes from a Friyadika is to dip, if you have no salt, dip it into sugar. Because some say that if you have to kasher chicken and there's no salt, you could use sugar. I saw Taka the Halachas Ketanas in Reishut Ches proves this. So once it's good for kashering, it's good for Hamoitzi Lechem also. Zok Tekav HaChaim and Sifkat and Lamed Zayin, this makes no sense to me. It's not a din in kashering. All the symbolism, a kol kabon thakiv melech, and three times Shem Havaya is melech, that doesn't work. So how does that work? Just because some hold, and Bechali says, we hold can't kasha with sugar. So Kaf HaChaim says there is an alternative that's much more doable. Take a piece of the challah or bread and dip it into the bread itself. Because the bread has some salt in it. Today's bread has salt in it. And lechem is the same oisius like melech. So that's better than using sugar. So the best thing is have salt when you go, and therefore you can be yotzim. Lamaisa, this is why the Paiskim say that when a person doesn't have salt, dipping the bread into the bread is a better alternative. Now, could you dip the bread or challah into a dip that has salt in it? The answer is yes. So you have at least a little bit salt, but avada dipping it into bread is better because lechem and melech is the same oisius. But to my knowledge, a dip and melech is not the same oisius or the same gematria for that matter. So another interesting halacha: after a person made hamoitzi today, tafshin pei hey, he realizes there's no salt on the table, and he wants to dip it in. Can he say, "Bring salt"? So that's not a good idea. Because first of all, you should know that even though the Gemara is matir to say Havei Melech, it's a machlokes in the Gemara. More so, the Ramah on our and Kuf Samach Zayin says, L'chatchil, don't talk. Better make her eat and then bring salt. We paskin, like the other sheet in the Gemara, that if you said Havei Melech, it's not a hefsik b'di'evid. But not that L'chatchil, it's a free-for-all. And that was in those days, even when you had to say have a Gevil Torah, which is based on a pasuk in the Torah. Today we have that lechem, that's metuval, that's very tasty. Then you don't need the salt. It's only, not only, but it's only alstem mekubalim. No. So is that enough to be matel lechatchil a hefsik? Probably not. But I would think, I didn't find this before, so I don't know why, but I think b'di'evet, if someone said bring salt, so even though it's no longer the din of the Gemara of lechem metuval, but it's still a pikabala. It's enough of a tzairich. Probably b'di'evet, you wouldn't have to repeat the bracha. Someone asked me, he heard as a minig that you should have salt on the table for the Suda and also for benching. Where's that coming from? So this the Kaf HaChaim and Kuf Pei Sivkot and Gimel. He quotes the Kitzur Shlah. We have the Kitzur Shlah as well, who says that since Shulchan Daimel Mizbeach, so make it a Mizbeach till the end, including benching. Okay. Grada, I'm sure you realize that's why there's a big focus on Mayim Achreinim. Why? So the Paiskim explain that the Gemara says that at the end of the meal you're supposed to eat salt. And you touch the salt with your hands. No, there is always an element of Melech Sdaimis in the salt. So therefore the Gemara in Chul and Kufheim Beis explains we have to have Mayim Achreinim because the end of the Suda, like we saw from Brachis Daf Mem, they ate salt with their fingers, and that's a problem of Melech Sdaimis. Now I've got a Melech Sdaimis also a Ruchnius, so it's a Ruchnius with a negative Ruchnius. That's why we wash Mayim Achreinim. Agav, I should also mention, once talking about Sdaim, the Mukabalim say that the women should be the ones that bring the salt to the table for the Suda because Loit's wife did her mistake. So it's sort of a kapara. Now, getting back to the Hilchas Brachas question that we began. So someone would ask, if I enjoy sucking salt on the sunflower seed, do I make a separate bracha? The answer to quote the Gemara is basically less dain tzarach baishish. It's a Fershi Gemara. It's a Gemara in Brachis that solved as a shackle, and the Mechaber Reish Dal says Sola Maisa. The only thing I would like to caution is the Mishnah Berurah explains why to make a bracha on salt, because yesh by akaponim hanoak tzas kishenoisen l'soich pid. Salt is not the most tasty thing in the world. In fact, it's very repulsive to many. And all the Paiskim, as I'll soon tell you, agree. If a person eats a spoonful of salt, he doesn't make a bracha. It's only when the salt is edible, and I think a good example is the salt on top of the sunflower seeds is not big salt granules, it's ground salt very finely, that's bearable. And if you like salt, it's okay. So that scenario, I think, is true. If you take the salt because you enjoy the salt, and the salt on sunflower seeds is a very mild type of salt, so you make a shackle, and you get to the seed, you make adama. But as the Poskim explain, when someone is not enjoying the salt, then you don't make a bracha. And what's interesting is, let's say a person needs a little bit salt in refuah. So if you look at the Shibbolei Aleket in Kuf Mem Tes, he says, a better example. Let's say a person ate a diet and had no salt whatsoever. So he decides to do Din HaGemara, and Acha Kol Achilascha Achoil Melech. Zok the Shibbolei Aleket, you don't make a bracha on that salt. You're only doing the refuah. And Oichel, the refuah, you make a bracha. But salt is not an Oichel. So you see, mamish, everything we said. Salt is not your typical oichel. Salt is more like water. If you enjoy it, good, make a bracha. You don't enjoy it, don't make a bracha. I once saw this. Someone came to a Shabbos Suda, and they served ice cream for dessert. So many people make a bracha. Not to. So the minig is, many people take a candy or chocolate and make a shackle, and then they have the ice cream. This person, I guess he didn't find chocolate on the table, so he stuck his finger into the salt dish, made a shackle on the salt, and ate it. So I think on him you could say, Le'amar it's chassid. Unless he enjoyed that salt, he's only eating it to make a bracha. That's not hana. Now, another point I should mention, for those that have a little nervin, they wonder, so how could I eat a salted sunflower seed? You put it in your mouth, and it's a nervous lashon. It's a psik reisha that the salt's going to go into your mouth. The answer is, don't worry about the salt in your mouth. Unless you're doing it like kavanas achila, there's no bracha. So lemaisa, again, on a rare scenario that you enjoy the salt, you make a bracha lachatchila taka. It's a Pharisee Gemara. But I did see the Kaf HaChaim Sivkot and Vav, and I was Simon, and the Birchas Abai is Hey, Dalet, both spell out very clearly. But there a cloud, plain salt that you don't enjoy, you don't make a bracha. Someone had the shaila, I mentioned earlier, it was slippery outside, it was winter, and he had no salt, the rock salt that's going to melt the ice, and he sprinkled some regular table salt. And someone said it's Bal Tashchis. So, without too much imagination, I'm sure you realize where we're heading. This is totally an hour shaila if salt is an oichel. And the we have two rayas from a Mishnah that salt is not an oichel. What is that? The Mishnah in Erevin that says regarding Erev Tchumin and regarding Nedarim, salt is not an oichel. So I saw the Sefer Eitz, I saw that, he quotes the Sefer, I don't have a true Chashu, was Metzach Aaron, that has this very shaila. And he says there is no Bal Tashchis with salt because it's not an oichel, like we see from the Mishnayos. In fact, there might be a shtickler raya, and this is Gemara in Erevin Kuf Dalid, Boiskin melech agabi keves b'shvil shelo yachliku. In other words, Rashi explains it was a little slippery, and especially when it was wet, people would slip. They would sprinkle salt to give it more stability, some traction. So the kasha, what about Bal Tashchis? What about Bizoyin Oichel? Must be there's no Bizoyin Oichel by salt, like water. Oh, so the emphasis is that it's not much of a raya because all agree that even food mamish, if you need it, let's say Adam is mut. You're allowed to take lemon and take off a stain. Lemon's very good taking off stains. But then I found a real Metzia, Rav Steinman, Zechayim Levrach, in the Ayelas Hashach in Zvochem Daf Samach Beis, where the Gemara says using salt for non-achila purposes. So he says, why is there no problem with Zoyin Oichel, using salt for non-achila purposes? So he points to the Gemara in Erevin Kuf Dal that I just mentioned. So he says, there we see, also they use salt. So he says that Lamaisa salt is an Oichel, because you make a brach on it. But it's not really such a raya, because you make a brach on it when you enjoy it, so it's like water. But he does say that salt, even though salt is not mekabel tuma, but it's not a raya that's not an oichel. But he basically says that even if there would be a problem of Bal Tashchis by salt, but when there's a tzorich adam, it would be mutter. So everything is there now. The truth is, best would be when you have a problem with ice to use the rock salt that's made specifically for that. But if there's no other choice, avada, it's better to sprinkle salt than to have people tripping. I also in a tshuva Hillel Oima Ois Kuf Yud Ches who was not happy with the meaning of throwing chitim on a chasen, even though it brings a certain siman bracha, but lamaisa bal tashchis, bizi oichel. So his suggestion is to use salt. It looks close enough, and salt, he feels, is no bal tashchis, like we said, is not an oichel. And now we can say achra and chav, the last group of questions is salt and Hilchas Shabbos. So we'll reduce it to the fear kashas. Number one, you took the woman forgot to put salt into the soup. She's hysterical, I'm not serving soup without salt. So number one, can you put salt into the hot kli rishon shoya gabi ha'esh? Number two, if that's not good, can you put salt into the serving bowl kli sheni? Number three, sprinkling salt onto a hot dava gush, a hot piece of kugel, chicken, etc. And once we're here, we'll talk about sugar. That's the third kasha, because that's very similar or very different than salt. So sit back and enjoy. The main question is, what is the status of salt in Hilchas Shabbos? Now, what do I mean to say? I'll tell you. Lamaisa, we find that the special halach is regarding spices, tavlin. For example, same shaila, but the woman put in salt, but forgot to put in pepper. And you can't serve without pepper. And again, Vaitish is hysterical, I have to do something. So the Mishnah Daf Membeis and Masech Shabbos discusses this very question very clearly. Zok the Mishnah that Lamaisa, to put pepper into the soup, al gabi eish avadazasa. That's at least mechzik mevashel, but more than that, mevashel. In fact, Zok the Mishnah, putting pepper, uncooked pepper, now typically our pepper is uncooked into a hot kli rishon shoya gabi ha'esh is also us. Why? So Rashi, because kli rishon mevashel. Because don't forget, it's not so much the fire heats the pot, and the pot really cooks the food. So Rashi is telling us a klal. Kli rishon shoya gabi ha'esh is mevashel. So presumably adding uncooked pepper to the hot pot of soup is a malacha deraisa of bishul. Pasha. So the question is, okay, I'm scared enough, I won't do it, fine. Can I put the soup into the serving bowl and then add uncooked pepper? So we know, even a klisheni, kali abishal is also. So you shouldn't be able to do that, right? Wrong. Zok the Mishnah, but klisheni is perfectly mutter. Kali abishal, we always choish even a klisheni. Well, we don't know what kali abishal is, but one thing we do know, spices, tavlin is not kali abishal. So midina Mishnah, and no one argues, you're allowed to put pepper into a klisheni, even though it's uncooked, because klisheni is incapable of cooking. Okay? Wonderful. So now, let's make a simple analogy. If you're allowed to put pepper into a klisheni, who adin salt? Right? Wrong. But terribly wrong. Let me tell you why. Because the Gemara has this shaila. Declared the Gemara in Shabbos Mem Beis Amad Beis, Savar Rabbi Yosef Lemeima, that salt is like tavlin. And the truth is, in our minds, it's in the same spice department, the spice drawer. It is a spice. So, but Rabbi Yosef made the logical conclusion that salt is like tavlin, like we said. But he says it's wrong. Why? But listen to his assumption. Because Lamaisa, it's much worse than tavlin. Tavlin cannot get cooked in a klisheni, but salt does get cooked even in a klisheni. So presumably putting salt into the serving bowl is malacha deraisa. Then the Gemara has a lishna basra, a second shita, that again, salt is not like a tavlin, but to the opposite extreme. Salt does not get cooked even in a kli rishon. It only gets cooked al gabi ha'esh, like tough meat is only cooked al gabi ha'esh. So now we see one thing. Salt is not a tavlin, l'chaladeis. But we have two l'shainos, two shitais. So what is salt? The Lishta Kama, referred to Lishta Kama, says salt gets cooked even a klisheni. Lishta Basra says, to the other extreme, salt never gets cooked even a kli rishon. Now, here we see something strange. What's going on here? All agree that salt is not tavlin, and some are makel, even a kli rishon. By me pligi, what's the machlokes talian? So, by me is bara, it's talian our original understanding. Salt is not a typical food, but I say more than that. Salt does not grow. Salt is not even like mushroom that grows from the air. Salt is a mineral. the salt that you have for lunch today is very old. It's Tafshin Pei Hey years. Since the Barsham created the world, the salt is there. So salt doesn't grow, is a mineral. So maybe the Lishta Basra holds, and this I don't mean to be funny, if you put a little of gold into your chicken soup, is there an Issa Bishul on gold? Obviously not. Why not? Because you can't cook a mineral. So salt, in a certain sense, is also like that. Just the only thing is, salt, because it's much softer, it gets cooked agabi or eish. But the Lishna Basra holds, salt is no bishul except agabi or eish. The Lishna Kama says, what are you talking about? We eat salt, and when salt is added, it gives very much to the food, so we treat it like tavam, but it's worse than that. Because einenu royos, it's a soluble and emerges with the soup. In other words, the machlaikis is, how do you define the word bishul? Rav Moshe has a beautiful tshuva in Chelik Beis, Pei Hey. Someone asked him that he realized, he heard, that the tea bags we have were cooked or baked beforehand. Doesn't make sense, but it does make sense. They take the tea leaves and they heat it in an intense heat to sterilize it. And then they put it in the bag and they sell it. So maybe we should consider tea like already ein bishul achafia. So Moshe said, that's nonsense, because look at the tea. You don't get to use a tea bag. He says bishul or afia is not heat. It's changing the item. So lemaisa, if you bake a dough, it becomes challah. You change it. But if you bake a tea bag, nothing changes. So Moshe defines the Issa Bishul as changing the item. He says this more clearly in Chelik Dal, Ayin Dal Sifkat and Tezvav. He says that he said, or Moshe held, you can put a raw tea bag in a kli shlishi on Shabbos. Someone said, but you see, the water gets colored and it becomes tea. So isn't that a raya that gets cooked in a kli shlishi? Moshe says it's nonsense. If you put a tea bag in cold water, it also gets colored. So must be, what's the pshat in bishul? Bishul is not just giving color. Bishul is changing it. And a kli shlishi is incapable of cooking a tea bag. It gives off the flavor, it gives the color, but doesn't cook. So Rav Moshe, in these two different shuvas, explains that bishul means changing the item. So it has to be along those lines. That's the machlaikis, lishta kama, lishta basra. But at the end of the day, everybody, let's be very clear. To sprinkle salt into the boiling hot pot of soup, according to lishna basra, is muta midina gemara. According to lishta kama, is malacha deraisa. How do we paskin? So the Maisa Toisvis on that Gemara paskins lahakol, like the Lishna Basra, that salt only gets cooked al gabi or eish. To add salt to the hot pot of soup is perfectly mutter. And Toisvis quotes a Maisa Rav, Rabbeinu Shmuel, that Taka was mata, Mamash Al Shaila, was mata to put salt into the Kli Rishon as long as it's lo al gabi or eish. This is a shita of the Rif, Rambam, Rosh, Rabbeinu Chananel, Rashbam, and Or Zarua. A pretty impressive list. And that's why the Machab in Shin Yod Ches Sif Tes says it's mutter to add salt to a Kli Rishon Lagabi Eish with no descent, no machlaikis. So according to that, we see a tremendous chiddush. Adding salt to a hot pot is mutter, to a davagush is mutter. What's the problem? However, we see something, in my limited knowledge, is rare. Toises adds, after this, Hamachma Kalish Nekama, Shalite Melech Bekaora calls Mansha Yatsu Ledis boy, Tavi Allah Bracha. Now we know Tzadikim say that often, Tavi Allah Bracha, but to find a reason that says that, I think is rare. Toises puts a spin on the whole sugya. That Lamai sits mutter, to add salt to the hot pot is mutter. But if you want to have a bracha from Toisvis, don't add the salt. Until it's a ka'ara, that's not hot. We'll soon see what that means. Now, why was Toisvis machmer if the Rishonim and Toisvis himself was mekel? There's his pashut. At the end of the day, you can't deny that this is sveika deraisa. According to the Lishta Kama, putting salt into a hot pot of soup is malacha deraisa. So you can't just ignore it. So Toisvis took the safe approach, hamach matavel abrach. Now, as if it's not rare enough that Toisvis matavel abracha, there's also the Mordechai in Masech Shabbos Shin Ches also says this lashon, as does the Aguda in Shabbos Oisamach Beis, Hamachmir Tavi Ola Bracha. And that's why the Ramah on the Mechaber that's matter without any sveikis, there must have a yesh oisrim lases melech afilu b'kli sheni sheyatzel ledus boy v'amachmer tavi ala bracha. So you realize our question is mamish toli in this shaila. Mi'ikid din all agree is mutter in a kli rishon lagabi eish, but we have a Ramah, Toisis, Mordechai, Aguda, many prominent brachas from Gedolei Olam, not to put it even in a kli sheni, because it might get cooked if the kli sheni is still hot. Now, Lamaisa, this obviously would give us an incentive. The Mechazalaza in Nuker Achaim, Simul Yudches, Shin Yudches, he quotes his father that said that really you ought to put salt into the hot pot, but it gives a little taste. That's true, but it's probably better to get a bracha from the Ramah. And don't do it. Now, I don't know why he doesn't mention not just the Ramah. It's a Tosfos, a Mordechai, and a Aguda. Okay? Now, before we apply this specifically, we have to make one more point. And that is, today's salt, table salt, there are different types. Now, I'm not going to get into the details because it's complicated, but I can explain it if anybody wants to hear it. Basically, there are different types of salts. In Eretz Yisrael, but they're a klal, I'll soon explain why. Their table salt was never cooked. They take salt that was put into the sea, the little reservoirs of salt water. The water evaporates and the salt remains. So the salt was never cooked. In America, more often than not, I can't say that better than that because it's not always, but more often than not, our table salt was already cooked. So now the question is, Enochanami, you can't put regular salt into a kli rishon because it gets cooked, but that's because of bishul deraisa. But the shaila is our salt that's cooked. No, you could put lokshin, dry cooked lokshin, into a hot pot because ain't bishul bishul. So why is salt different? If we have salt that is fully cooked, again I'm talking about the big if, why should it be a problem? And the emes is from Tais, we don't see anything differently. The Mordechai that I mentioned, after he says don't put salt into a kli rishon because it's machlokes, tavla bracha, he says another tavla bracha. He says, he quotes Rabbeinu Dan, also a rare rishon to quote, but Melech Shalanu, in his times, that the salt is cooked, really you could put it into a hot soup. But a machmir, tavla bracha, not to put it in a filu kli sheni when it's a yatzer ledus boy. And the Aguda follows from the same Rabbeinu Dan, not to put salt that's cooked even into a kli sheni. Now the big question is, why is that so? Why is salt different than lokshin? And probably that's why the Magen Avraham, in the end of Sif Katan Lamed Aleph, says, Yirali, the Melech Sha'oisen, Mimayim Shemevashan Oisai, Ein by Mishum Bishul, Ein Bishlach Bishul. Now why he says Yirali, it's the Mordechai and the Aguda, it's a kasha. But then he says, am Asher Kesafti, Shin Yud Chesif Katan Mem. Now this is interesting, because there we find something very similar to salt. The Mechaber says you're allowed to take a piece, a pashtida, or infanda, which basically is a food that has a gravy, a congealed gravy, a fatty gravy that's congealed. So you're allowed to take a piece of kugel or chicken, whatever it is, put it next to the fire, even though the congealed gravy liquefies and becomes a liquid. Now why is that mutter? Bishleima, to put the solid food is mutter, ain't bishlach bishul. But the gravy is the liquid. So Magen Avraham says, yeah, but when you put it next to the fire, it was a solid. So we treat it like a salad across the board, and ain bishlach bishul, you're allowed to do it. So the Ifah says, Magen Avraham, so how could salt be worse? So let's be clear. According to the Magen Avraham, to put salt into a salt that's already cooked into a kli rishon shalei gabi or eish is perfectly mutter. And he doesn't mention anything about a tavei ala bracha. And that's definitely the shita of the Magen Avraham. However, as I told you, the Mordechai, the Aguda, and a whole host of Paiskim, the Zera Emes, the Kiva Eiga, the Rav Shulchan Aruch, Ram Shik, and Kuf Lamed Beis, the Kitzur Aruch HaShulchan, all say Tavila Bracha applies even to our cooked salt. And now you have a double question. First of all, why do you say that? And also, what do you do with the raya the Magen Avraham brought? Magen Avraham brought a beautiful raya from the Bashtida, from the Infanda. So I'll tell you a really beautiful thing. Let's say Friday night you served the children soup, and they didn't want it. So you have 3 bowls of untouched soup, and now it's cold. And Lamaisa, someone brings home guests, unexpected guests, and you're short soup. Can you take the 3 bowls of cold, fully cooked soup, and put it into the hot pot of soup? You want to warm up the soup to serve the guests. You're putting cold soup into a hot kli rishon. So we all know that's asa. Why is it asa? Ein bishlach a bishul. Teretz, it's a davalach. Davalach, yes, bishlach a bishul, right? Fine. Now the question is, how do you look at salt in halacha? Is salt a lach or is salt a yavesh? The truth is that salt is more than a lach. Not only is salt, when you put it in right away, it becomes a liquid, but salt is soluble. It takes on the identity of the soup itself. Zog de machsa shekel, the end of Sif Cotton Lamed Aleph, and all the other places that I mentioned that are machma say the same yisoid, we have to treat salt, because it's a soluble, like a liquid. So just like you can't put a cold soup into the kli rishon, so too salt is like a davalach, and yesh bishul acha bishul, and that's the reason why they are machmer. What about the Magen Avram's Raifman Fanda? So Zok the Chutshani Chelik Beisim and Ahmed Kuf Pei Zayin, very pashit. Lamaisa, the fat does not become mayim or soup like the host that's in. It becomes like a liquid, but it's still eaten like a food. But the salt in the soup completely merges, is a soluble, and it loses identity. And that taka becomes a liquid. So Rabbi, let's be clear. By salt that was never cooked before, again, Eretz Yisrael and some American salts, that is not just a chumrah of davalach, dav yavesh, that's a safek deraisa. So even though Allah is mutter, someone does it, you can't give him skila, that's for sure. But there's a real tavala bracha to be chayshiv with the sheet that yesh bishul by salt. But lamaisa, salt that was already cooked, that is only a chumrah, which the Magen Avraham didn't hold of, obviously, but it's a chumrah that we treated like a davalach. So now, lamaisa, to apply this lamaisa, let's be very clear. To add salt that was never cooked to a kli rishon of others awesome, even a kli sheni, and that's more than the secondary tavala bracha. To add salt to a pot and the salt was fully cooked before, that we could say lamaisa tavala bracha. Mr. Bura has a very mild endorsement of this chumrah. He writes a lashon melech letrei that's already cooked. Toiv li zor b'kli rishon lechatchila. So you probably more night to go to Magen Avraham. But like the Minchas Elazar writes, you want a bracha of Toisvis, Mordechai, Aguda, Ramah. So put it in a kli sheni. Now why is kli sheni better? Truth is, it shouldn't be better. But since it's only a chumrah that we're treating salt like a davalach, so a zoifil dafnish chayshizayin. So you're allowed to add pre-cooked salt into the serving bowl, and then the woman could serve it without feeling very guilty. And that's the Chayr Pashit. Now, the next halacha should be mentioned is regarding put it onto a dava gush, which means you take a piece of kugel or chicken and you want to sprinkle salt on it. Now, what's the shayla? I'm talking about uncooked salt. So the truth is, uncooked salt on a dava gush, hot kugel or chicken, is about the asa memanashach. Because if you say dava gush is like a kli rishon, so that's tama malacha, you're putting salt into a kli rishon. Even if you say that dava gush is a kli sheni, because the mais is on my plate, but the mais, the uncooked salt is going onto a kli sheni, onto a food in kli sheni, and that we said is awesome. If it's still piping hot, this dava gush could cook salt. So no doubt about it, putting salt, uncooked salt, onto a dava gush is a serious problem. It's only that, it's a lishtakana versus lishna basra, and there's a very good reason to say tavila bracha not to do it at all. But the shaila is, can you put cooked salt onto a dava gush? So if you treat dava gush like a kli sheni, why not? But since halacha we treat dava gush something like a kli rishon, it should be awesome. But here I saw a beautiful yisod of Shlomo Zalman and Shmir Shabbos and Aleph Kuf Ayin Tes. And he says that be'emes, really the salt is cooked already. What's your problem? You're treating salt like a davalach. But that's when you put it into a liquid. When you put it into a piece of chicken, it becomes a davayavesh. So it's the same davayavesh. It ain't bishul acha bishul. So once you say that there's no problem of the soluble part of it, it goes into a solid food. So what do we have? Number one is tavala brach at most. And also davagush is a machlaikis. So to sprinkle cooked salt onto a davagush, Rav Moshe was makel, Rav Shlomo was makel, but it's the same beautiful svara. Now, lamaisa, sugar is very similar to salt, but extremely different. Now, I want to explain. Sugar and salt have one thing in common. They are both solubles. They both merge, mamish, with the liquid you put into it. But there are two major differences between salt and sugar that impacts halacha in a very big way. Salt, we could say, was never cooked. There are salts in America today, and certainly in many in Eretz Yisrael, that were never cooked. Sugar always was cooked. Whether you have cane sugar or beet sugar, the sugar itself was cooked with water. It became a very sweet liquid. They dehydrated the water, took out the water, and you're left with sugar. All sugar, to my knowledge today, across the board, all sugar is cooked. Number two difference, unlike salt, that the Lishta Kama hold is worse than tavlin, sugar is not worse than tavlin. Sugar is a tavlin. Sugar is not salt, because salt has that property of it being a mineral, and we don't know what it is, but sugar, we know what it is. So therefore, let me be clear. If you have sugar in your coffee cup, and you want to pour hot water from the urn straight onto the sugar, so mi'ikad din, that should be mutter. Why? Ain bishul acha bishul, it's already fully cooked, and what are you doing wrong? Iri kli rishon, ain bishul acha bishul. The only thing is, we're going to say that since we treat this like a soluble, like salt, there's a makam lahachma not to do that, because it's a davalach, which is like a davalach, and taka it merged with a davalach, and that's why the meaning is we first put the water in, then we add the sugar and coffee. Agav, the coffee is the same like sugar. The coffee actually, the instant coffee was cooked, fully cooked, and made into the granules. It was freeze dried, whatever it is. And it has the same issue of it being a soluble. So that's why there's no doubt about it. Adding sugar to a kli rishon, mamish, should be a tavala bracha. Kli sheni should not be an issue. Let me just spend 2 minutes to explain the metzias of why I said salts are different. Lamaisa, in the way the world is, you should know everything, and this I'm not joking, everything is totally in money. That's basically the way it is. But the truth is that in Eretz Yisrael, because they have months and months without rain and very sunny weather, they could afford to do it in a very economical way. They take ponds of salt water, put it into these little smaller ponds, and it just sits there, and the water eventually evaporates, and you have salt. That salt, of course, is treated proper chemically. That salt was never cooked. So you have table salt, looks like ours, was never cooked. But the system in America, where you have rain and you have different climate, you can't rely on that, is that they pump they put the hot water into the salt mines, they pump the water out, so it's a whole chachma, and then they cook it. Now, but there are different stages in the cooking. Some of it is temperatures of cooking, and some is lower than that. But more often than not, the salt is cooked, but there is sometimes salt was never cooked. Also, some salts, I underline the word some, it's a small minority, some salts are made from the rock salt that are mined from mountains and underground that come out like boulders of salt. All that's grub salt, kosher salt, rock salt, but it's all salt that was solid and was ground up, never cooked. So that's why they will do whatever's cheaper. Like they have a system how to save money on the hydration. They use a temperature that's not Yad Soledes by. So to make a long story short, we can assume in America, hopefully, that the salt was cooked. There it's it's not cooked. If things changes, it changes. I'll go and talk to you all. David Kaddish. Amen. Hey, Shmei Abba, yeah. That's what it is. Okay, that's what I meant. Okay, good. Yeah. Good. Okay, let's just chaz what we learned today first. Thank you very much for coming today and recording it. Salt is not a regular oichel. There are many rayas that it's not an oichel. The main fact in Metzias, it's a mineral, but surely it's not a tavlin. That's for sure. I would say salt is a min b'fnei atzma, more similar to water than anything else. We saw 4 halachis that it's similar to water: the hilchas erevin, nedarim, hilchas brachis, hilchas baltashchis. But basically, the minig of putting salt in a house before you move in is based on the fact that b'choisa kol means we don't have salt, but the school of it is to give it to an ani. Salt is a skula for zikarim, but better to chaza, because I'm not sure what the skula really is. Salt, the concept of salt, of dipping into the salt, is really a different yesod. The real salt in Medina Gemara is to make the hamaitzi more tasty, and that's why a dip was a viable option. But Tais has already introduced us. Tais and the Shmuel Leket and Mekubalim are very busy. There's another whole objective of salt. Salt is making from Piranius. Salt is a Ruchnius that was yearning for Kedusha. And from the minig of having it on the table to save us from calamity, the minig also became to dip it in 3 times with much symbolism. Taisvis is making like a mizbeach, salt on the table. Even if you don't use the salt, it should be there. But the point is that if someone wants to know halachis, halacha today there's no chi of salt, but the Ramah and based on Rishonim do require it to the extent that even the Megabalim say dip 3 times the bread into the salt. Now there is, as we told you, there's more significance, but basically it has some type of ruchni that we need by a Suda. The real minig is dipping into salt, not sprinkling, even though it's not ma'akiv, but definitely if you do it right, you do it by dipping 3 times into the salt. You don't have to eat the salt, you could dip it in and blow it off. There are different hagim regarding Pesach. Some don't want to part with the minig of dipping, but minig Ashkenaz is not to use salt at all. Leil Rosh Hashanah we should use both salt and honey. It's not a stira. The Chassam Sofer's minig Leil Shabbos is based on Kol Kaban Chatak Melech, not to use salt Friday night. If a person doesn't have salt, he could dip it into bread, which is better than dip it into a dip or dipping it into sugar. L'chatchila, don't say Havei Melech, not in those days, and certainly not today. I think b'diavad, it wouldn't be a hefsik. Salt on the table is recommended until after benching. Mayim Achrayim is because they ate salt. The bracha on salt is only if you enjoy it. If you have it in your mouth, but you're not interested in the salt just to get the sunflower, don't make a bracha on the salt. If you enjoy the salt, make a shakol. Spreading salt on ice, if there's no other salt available, is okay. It's not baltashkas or bizi oichel. Hilchas Shabbos, salt is not like a tavlin. Again, mi'ikad din, you could put it into a kli rishon, shalagabi eish. But the minig is to be machmir, to put uncooked salt, not even a kli sheni. Cooked salt can be put into a kli sheni, and as we said, sugar, a davagush is okay with even uncooked with cooked salt. And the less sugar is better than salt. It's a soluble, but then again, it is vade cooked, and also it is a tavlin, so klisheni is definitely mutter. Thank you very much. Thank you. You too.